The morning rush hour crowd at Washington, D.C.'s Union Station moved like a river of humanity, thousands of commuters flowing toward the metro turnstiles in the familiar dance of urban transportation. Among them, 79-year-old Harold Thompson made his way slowly but steadily toward the senior military discount gate, the same route he'd taken every Tuesday for 15 years to reach his VA appointments. His Korean War veteran cap sat proudly on his gray head, his military ID ready in his weathered hand, just as it had been hundreds of times before. But today would be different. Security Supervisor Marcus Wright, stationed at the fare control area, noticed the elderly man approaching, and something about Harold's appearance triggered every assumption he'd developed about people trying to game the system. "Hold up there," Wright called out, his voice cutting through the morning noise like a blade. "I need to see that military ID." Harold paused, genuinely confused by the sudden scrutiny. "Of course, sir," he replied, extending the card he'd presented countless times without question. Wright examined the ID with theatrical suspicion, turning it over multiple times under his security station light. "This looks questionable to me," he announced, loud enough for nearby commuters to hear. "We get a lot of people trying to use fake military cards for discount." The accusation hit Harold like a physical blow. In all his years of using Metro, through all his medical appointments and errands, no one had ever questioned his service or suggested his identification was anything but authentic. "Sir, I can assure you that card is genuine," Harold said, his voice steady despite the growing humiliation. "I've been using it for 15 years. Wright's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "That's exactly what someone with a fake ID would say. Look at you. You think you look like a real veteran." The words echoed across the fare control area, causing a growing crowd of commuters to stop and stare. Some pulled out phones, sensing that something significant was happening. Harold felt every eye in the station turn toward him, transforming his routine Tuesday morning into a public spectacle of doubt and accusation. What Wright didn't know, what his assumptions and prejudices blinded him to, was that 6 young men in civilian clothes had been standing in the coffee line when the confrontation began. They weren't tourists or office workers, despite their casual dress and unremarkable appearance. They were United States Marines, returning from deployment, traveling in civilian clothes for security reasons, and they had heard every word of Harold's humiliation. Harold Thompson had first entered Union Station in 1952, shipping out to Korea with the 1st Marine Division. Now, 67 years later, he returned every Tuesday for VA appointments, managing the lingering effects of wounds from the Chosin Reservoir. Harold had served 20 years in the Marine Corps, earning the Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and Silver Star through combat in Korea and Vietnam. After retiring in 1972, he'd worked as a machinist, raised a family, and lived quietly with memories that sometimes still visited him in the early morning hours. The Metro had become Harold's lifeline to VA medical care. His Tuesday appointments required regular trips that would have been impossible without public transportation, and he'd never had his military ID questioned in 15 years of use. Marcus Wright had been working Metro security for 8 years after failing police academy training. At 34, he'd developed strong opinions about military discount abuse, convinced that many elderly men presenting military IDs were using fraudulent identification. He'd begun seeing himself as a guardian against stolen valor fraud. This Tuesday morning, something about Harold's modest appearance triggered Wright's suspicions. The elderly man's worn clothing looked exactly like what Wright expected from someone carrying fake military ID. Wright examined Harold's ID theatrically, though it was clearly authentic with proper security features. He'd already committed to his performance for other potential fraud artists watching. "This looks questionable to me," Wright announced, holding Harold's military ID up to the light as if checking for watermarks. The card was clearly authentic, with all the proper security features and official seals, but Wright had already committed to his course of action. "We get a lot of people trying to use fake military cards for discounts." Harold stood patiently while Wright performed his examination, though confusion was beginning to give way to something deeper. He'd presented this same identification hundreds of times over 15 years, and it had never been questioned. The card was issued by the Department of Veterans Affairs, bore his photograph and vital information, and was renewed regularly through proper channels. "Sir, I can assure you that card is genuine," Harold said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone accustomed to dealing with bureaucracy. "I've been using it for 15 years without any problems." Wright's response was swift and dismissive. "That's exactly what someone with a fake ID would say. Look at you. You think you look like a real veteran?" The words hung in the air like a physical assault. Harold felt every person in the immediate area turn to look at him, their morning routines interrupted by what was rapidly becoming a public spectacle. Cell phones were appearing in hands, their cameras pointing in his direction as the confrontation escalated. But Wright wasn't finished with his performance. "Real veterans don't dress like this," he continued, gesturing at Harold's modest clothing. "Real veterans have documentation that doesn't look like it came from some internet scam site. And real veterans don't get defensive when their identification is properly checked." Harold absorbed each word with quiet dignity, but inside, something was breaking. He'd faced enemy fire without flinching, but this public humiliation cut deeper than any physical wound. 6 young men in civilian clothes had been in the coffee line when Wright's confrontation began. They were Marines from the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, returning from deployment and traveling in civilian clothes for security. Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez was the first to notice the humiliation unfolding. Rodriguez was 28, with 5 deployments and a Bronze Star. Johnson was 26 from Detroit with 3 combat tours. The others, Martinez, Thompson, Chen, and Washington, were equally experienced Marines who understood that disrespecting one veteran meant disrespecting them all. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Thompson whispered, his hands clenching into fists. "That man served his country, and this rent-a-cop is treating him like a criminal." Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. The bonds of military brotherhood didn't recognize age, rank, or era of service. When one veteran was disrespected, they were all disrespected. When someone's military service was questioned without cause, it was an attack on everyone who had ever worn the uniform. "Gentlemen," Rodriguez said quietly to his Marines, "we're not letting this slide." Meanwhile, at the fare control area, Wright was escalating the situation further. "I'm going to need you to step aside," he announced to Harold, his voice carrying across the terminal. "I'm calling my supervisor to examine this fake ID and verify whether you have any legitimate claim to military benefit." Harold felt his face burn with embarrassment as hundreds of travelers watched him being singled out and humiliated. Security cameras were recording the interaction, passengers were openly filming with their phones, and he could imagine the headlines: "Elderly man accused of stolen valor at metro station." "Sir," Harold said, his voice still controlled despite the storm of emotions inside him, "I understand you're doing your job, but I'm telling you the truth. I served my country for 20 years, and I earned every benefit I received through combat service in Korea and Vietnam." Wright's response was swift and cruel. "Save it for someone who believes you, old man. Real veterans don't have to prove themselves by making up elaborate stories about their service. If you were really some kind of war hero, you'd have better documentation than this questionable ID that probably came from some online scam site." That's when Sergeant Rodriguez stepped out of the coffee line. At 28, Rodriguez was a compact, muscular man who moved with the fluid precision of someone trained for combat. His 5 deployments had taken him to Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and other places that didn't appear on official mission reports. He'd earned his rank through leadership under fire, and he carried the quiet confidence of someone who had proven himself in situations where lives depended on split-second decisions. "Excuse me," Rodriguez said, approaching the fare control area with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with this gentleman." Wright looked up from Harold's ID, annoyed at the interruption, and clearly irritated that his display of authority was being questioned. "Sir, please move along. This security matter doesn't concern you." Rodriguez smiled, but there was nothing friendly or accommodating about it. It was the kind of smile that seasoned warriors wore when they were about to demonstrate just how wrong someone's assumptions could be. "Actually, it concerns me very much," Rodriguez replied, his voice remaining calm but taking on an edge that made several nearby commuters stop what they were doing and pay attention. You see, I'm active duty military, and so are my 5 teammates over there. We've been listening to you disrespect a fellow veteran for the past 10 minutes, and we're not going to stand for it anymore." As if responding to an unspoken command, the other 5 Marines stepped out of the coffee line and formed a semicircle around the fare control area. They didn't say anything threatening, didn't make any aggressive gestures, but their presence was unmistakable and immediately commanding. These weren't ordinary commuters. They moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit, and their bearing left no doubt that they were dangerous men who knew exactly what they were doing. Wright's confidence began to waver as he found himself facing 6 of the most highly trained warriors in the American military. The casual authority he'd been wielding over an elderly man suddenly seemed much less impressive when confronted by men who were clearly accustomed to real authority and real responsibility. "Look, I don't know who you think you are," Wright said, his voice losing some of its earlier arrogance, "but I'm just doing my job here. This man's ID looks suspicious, and I have every right to question it." "I'm Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps," Rodriguez interrupted, pulling out his military ID with the same crisp precision that Harold had displayed earlier. "These are my Marines. We've just returned from deployment overseas, and we're traveling home to see our families, just like this gentleman here." He gestured toward Harold, who was watching the interaction with a mixture of gratitude, amazement, and profound relief that someone was finally standing up for him. Corporal Johnson stepped forward, his own military ID in hand, his expression serious and professional. "Corporal David Johnson, U.S. I'd like to take a look at this gentleman's ID that you claim is fake, because I've been through military security checks hundreds of times, and I know what authentic documentation looks like." Wright found himself surrounded by 6 Marines, and his bravado began to crumble rapidly. The situation had escalated far beyond what he'd expected when he decided to question an elderly commuter's military identification. "Now wait just a minute," Wright started to protest. "No, you wait," Rodriguez said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more intimidating than any shout could have been. "This man told you he served his country with honor. He told you he earned his benefits through military service in combat zone. And instead of thanking him for his sacrifice like any decent American would do, you accused him of stolen valor in front of hundreds of people." Lance Corporal Martinez stepped forward, his phone held conspicuously in his hand, still recording. "What's your name, sir? I want to make sure I spell it correctly when I post this video online for the world to see." Wright's face went pale as he realized the implications. "You can't record me without my permission. This is federal property." "Actually, I can," Martinez replied calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. "We're in a public place. You're a public employee performing your duties, and you're publicly humiliating a veteran who deserves much better treatment than this. The First Amendment protects my right to document this interaction." By now, the confrontation had drawn a significant crowd. Other commuters were gathering around the fare control area, forming an impromptu audience that was clearly sympathetic to Harold and increasingly hostile toward Wright. Many of them were recording with their phones, and the atmosphere in the station had shifted from the usual rushed indifference to something more electric and charged with moral outrage. Private Thompson turned to Harold, his expression softening with the kind of respect that one warrior shows to another. "Sir, what's your name and unit? We'd like to know who we're standing with." "Harold Thompson, retired," Harold replied, his voice stronger now that he had allies standing with him. "I served with the 1st Marine Division in Korea and later with various units during 2 tours in Vietnam." "When were you in Korea?" Johnson asked, his tone respectful and interested. 1952 to 1954, Harold replied. "Lost a lot of good Marines over there, but we did our job and brought as many home as we could." Rodriguez nodded, recognizing the quiet way Harold described his service. Real veterans didn't brag about their actions or embellish their stories. They simply stated the facts and let others draw their own conclusions, understanding that those who had served would recognize the truth, and those who hadn't served wouldn't fully understand regardless of how the story was told. "What decorations did you earn during your service, sir?" Rodriguez asked, though he suspected from Harold's bearing and the way he carried himself that this was a man who had seen significant combat and distinguished himself under fire. Harold hesitated for a moment, not out of uncertainty, but because he'd spent his entire post-military life avoiding this particular conversation. Not because he was ashamed of his service, but because he'd learned that talking about his decorations often made people uncomfortable or led them to treat him differently than he wanted to be treated. "I received the usual array of service medals," Harold said carefully, "including 2 Purple Hearts for wounds received in action during my tours in Korea and Vietnam." Chen, the youngest of the Marines, stepped forward. "Sir, with all due respect," the sergeant asked, "what decorations you earned?" "All of them. We're military, and we understand the significance of military honors. You don't have to downplay your service record with us." Harold looked around at the crowd of people recording the interaction, then back at the 6 young Marines who had stepped forward to defend his honor. These men understood the weight of military service, the cost of combat, and the bonds that connected all who had worn the uniform in service to their country. They deserved the truth, even if it made him uncomfortable to share it. "I was awarded the Bronze Star for actions during the Chosin Reservoir campaign," Harold said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the ambient noise of the terminal, "and the Silver Star for leading my squad through an enemy ambush during my second tour." The words hit the crowd like a physical force, creating a ripple effect of silence that spread outward from the fare control area. Murmurs and whispers died away as people processed what they had just heard. The Bronze Star and Silver Star were among America's highest decorations for combat valor, awarded only for extraordinary heroism under fire. Harold Thompson wasn't just a veteran. He was a decorated war hero who had risked his life to save others in some of the most brutal fighting of 2 different wars. Rodriguez's expression shifted immediately to one of profound respect and awe. In 8 years of military service, he had never met a Silver Star recipient in person. "Sir, would you be willing to show us your citation? I think everyone here would benefit from understanding exactly what kind of man they're witnessing." Harold nodded slowly and carefully reached into his wallet, retrieving a folded document that he had carried for over 60 years. His hands, weathered by age but still steady, unfolded the citation slowly, revealing the official Silver Star recommendation signed by his commanding officer and approved by the Secretary of the Navy. Rodriguez took the citation with the reverence normally reserved for sacred documents, cleared his throat, and began to read aloud, his voice carrying across the now completely silent terminal. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy while serving as a squad leader with the 1st Marine Division during combat operations in the Republic of Korea. When his platoon was ambushed by a superior enemy force, Sergeant Thompson repeatedly exposed himself to intense hostile fire to direct the evacuation of wounded Marines and coordinate defensive positions. Despite being wounded himself, he single-handedly destroyed 2 enemy machine gun positions and led a counterattack that saved the lives of 12 American Marines. His extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Marine Corps." The terminal was completely silent as Rodriguez finished reading, the weight of Harold's actions settling over everyone present like a heavy blanket. Even Wright stood motionless, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had done. He had just accused a Silver Star recipient, one of America's most decorated combat veterans, of stolen valor in front of hundreds of witnesses and multiple recording devices. Washington pulled out his phone and began scrolling through military databases, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Sergeant Harold Thompson, Silver Star recipient, Korean War. Here's his official record," he announced, turning his phone screen toward the crowd. "Bronze Star, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts with oak leaf clusters, Korean Service Medal, Vietnam Service Medal, and dozens of other decorations spanning a 20-year career. This man is a legitimate American hero." Wright was completely trapped now. He was surrounded by 6 Marines, facing a crowd of increasingly angry commuters, and dealing with a veteran whose heroic service record was being verified in real time by people who knew exactly what they were looking at. The situation was spiraling completely out of his control, and he was beginning to realize that his career was probably over. But Johnson wasn't finished with his lesson. As an African-American Marine who had faced his own share of skepticism and discrimination throughout his career, he understood the unique challenges that came with being unfairly targeted based on assumptions about who you were supposed to be or what you were capable of achieving. "Sir," Johnson said to Wright, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If this gentleman had been younger, would you have questioned his ID with the same level of suspicion and public humiliation?" Wright's face flushed red as he realized where the question was leading. This isn't about age discrimination, isn't it?" Johnson pressed, his voice gaining strength and moral authority. "Because I've been through this station dozens of times over the years, and I've never seen you question a younger veteran's ID with this level of scrutiny and public skepticism. But here's an elderly hero, and suddenly you're an expert on fake military identification and stolen valor case." The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Everyone in the terminal could see exactly what had happened. An elderly veteran was being discriminated against by a security guard who had made assumptions based on age and appearance rather than facts, evidence, and the basic respect that any veteran deserved. Chen, who had been quietly observing the confrontation, stepped forward to add his own perspective. "Sir, I'm Chinese American. I've been a Marine for 3 years, and I've never had my military ID questioned with this level of hostility and public suspicion. But I've watched elderly veterans get questioned, doubted, and humiliated all the time. Why do you think that is?" Wright was completely out of his depth now. He'd expected to handle one difficult passenger and move on with his day, maintaining his authority and control over the situation. Instead, he was facing 6 Marines, a growing crowd of angry commuters, who were clearly on the veteran's side, and multiple cameras recording his every word and reaction for posterity and social media distribution. But this story was far from over. What happened next would shake the entire metro system and lead to nationwide changes in how veterans were treated at public transportation facilities. Rodriguez turned to address the crowd that had gathered around the fare control area. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sergeant Harold Thompson, retired United States Marine Corps. He served 2 combat tours, earned the Silver Star and Bronze Star for actions under fire, and gave 20 years of his life to defending our freedom. He saved 12 American lives in Korea and countless others in Vietnam." The crowd erupted in applause, people cheering and some wiping away tears as they recognized Harold's heroism. The 6 Marines arranged themselves around him for photos that would later go viral, showing military brotherhood across generations and proving that respect for veterans knows no boundaries of age or era of service. Wright, realizing his career was over, quietly approached Harold. "Sir, I want to apologize. I was completely wrong, and I'm sorry for disrespecting your service." Harold, with the grace of a true Marine, looked at the man who had humiliated him and chose forgiveness over revenge. "Son, when a veteran shows you their ID, they're showing you a piece of their soul. Remember that." Rodriguez addressed the crowd one final time. "This is what military brotherhood looks like. When one of us is disrespected, we all feel it. Sergeant Thompson represents the best of American military service, and he should never have to prove that to anyone." The Marines helped Harold through the turnstiles with full military honors, ensuring he had everything needed for his journey to the VA hospital. The video of the confrontation would be viewed over 20 million times in the first week, sparking nationwide conversations about veteran treatment and leading to policy changes at transportation facilities across the country. Wright was suspended and ultimately fired. Metro implemented new training programs, and Harold received a formal apology from the Secretary of Transportation. Harold made his VA appointment that day, accompanied by 6 Marines who ensured he received proper respect. The Marines stayed in touch with Harold, visiting him regularly and proving that military service transcends generations. Harold would later speak at military events, sharing his story and inspiring others. But most importantly, he would never again face skepticism about his service. The 6 Marines had taught the world a valuable lesson that day. When good people witness injustice, they must act. They had shown that military brotherhood transcends rank, branch, and generation, reminding everyone that heroes deserve respect regardless of age. Harold Thompson had saved 12 lives in Korea 67 years earlier, but that day at Union Station, 6 Marines had saved something equally important: his dignity, his honor, and his faith in the brotherhood of those who serve.